7 years. That's how long I've lived in this neighborhood, trying to befriend my distant, standoffish neighbor, Mr. Grayson, a retired war veteran. He kept to himself, his silence guarded by the tall, ivy-covered fence between our properties. I tried everything: small talk, offering him cookies during the holidays, even shoveling his driveway after a snowstorm. But nothing broke through his icy demeanor. It wasn't just me. The entire neighborhood had long given up trying to connect with him. People whispered stories about his past, but no one really knew the man behind the mysterious exterior. And then something extraordinary happened. Not because of me, but because of Max, my cheerful, tail-wagging golden retriever. Max is more than just a pet. He's a bundle of joy, the glue that holds my chaotic life together. Little did I know, he'd soon become the unlikely hero in a story I could have never imagined. It all started on a crisp Saturday morning. I let Max out in the backyard as usual, expecting him to chase his tennis ball or sniff around for squirrels. But this time, he did something completely out of character. He bolted straight to the fence that separated our yard from Mr. Grayson's and started barking. Not his playful bark, but an urgent, almost commanding one. My heart skipped a beat. Was he hurt, or had he sensed something unusual? Before I could even process what was happening, Max did something I'd never seen him do. He clawed and pushed at a loose plank in the fence until it gave way, squeezing his body through to the other side. I was shocked and worried. Mr. Grayson wasn't exactly known for his love of uninvited visitors, human or otherwise. I hurried after Max, unsure of what I'd find on the other side. What I saw left me speechless. There was Max, standing right next to Mr. Grayson, wagging his tail as if they were old friends. But the look on Mr. Grayson's face wasn't anger. It was something else entirely. For the first time, I saw the stern lines on his face soften. But why? What had Max done to break down a barrier I couldn't in 7 long years? That's when I realized this was just the beginning. I froze for a moment, watching the scene unfold. Mr. Grayson, the man who barely acknowledged a wave or a polite hello, was crouching down, his hand resting gently on Max's head. It wasn't just the physical gesture, it was the look in his eyes. They were softer, almost vulnerable, as if Max had managed to touch something buried deep within him. I didn't want to intrude, but curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I made my way through the gap in the fence, half expecting him to bark at me to leave. Instead, he looked up and gave me a nod, his expression unreadable. "Your dog's got a good heart," he said gruffly, his voice carrying a weight that felt heavier than the words themselves. "I haven't seen a dog like this in, well, a long time." I smiled awkwardly, unsure of how to respond. Max wagged his tail furiously, nuzzling closer to Mr. Grayson as if he'd found a long-lost friend. "Yeah, he's a good boy," I said, scratching the back of my neck. "Sorry about him squeezing through the fence like that. I'll fix it right away." But Mr. Grayson shook his head. "Don't worry about it," he muttered, almost as if talking to himself. "Sometimes things happen for a reason." There was something in his tone, something unresolved, like a story waiting to be told. But instead of elaborating, he stood up and gave Max one last pat before retreating toward his house. Max, surprisingly, stayed by his side, as if he belonged there. It was strange. Max was usually glued to me, following me everywhere, but now he seemed perfectly content standing beside Mr. Grayson, tail wagging, eyes bright. "Max, come on, buddy," I called out, feeling a bit uneasy. Max hesitated, glancing between the two of us. For a brief second, I thought he wouldn't come back, but then he trotted over to me, his usual happy self. As we walked back to our yard, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. What was it about Max that had managed to break through Mr. Grayson's walls in just a few minutes? And why did it feel like this was only the beginning of something much bigger? Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain. I had to find out. Over the next few days, something unusual began to happen. Every morning when I let Max out, he'd make a beeline for the fence. Sometimes he'd just sit there, staring at the gap he'd created, his ears perked up as if waiting for something. Or someone. Other times, I'd catch him slipping through to the other side. At first, I tried to stop him, worried that Mr. Grayson would grow annoyed with my dog invading his space. But every time I called Max back, he'd return with the same look, almost pleading, like he was asking me to trust him. One afternoon, curiosity got the best of me. I decided to follow Max and see what he was up to. Quietly, I approached the fence and peeked through the gap. There he was, sitting patiently beside Mr. Grayson, who was seated on an old wooden bench in his backyard. The two of them looked so natural together, like old companions sharing a quiet moment. But what caught my attention was what Mr. Grayson was holding, a faded photograph. His hands trembled as he stared at it, the edges worn from years of handling. "Good boy, Max," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You remind me of him, you know, always sticking around when I needed it most." I felt like I was intruding on something deeply personal, but I couldn't look away. Who was he talking about? And why did Max seem to understand him so well? My dog sat still, as if he could sense the weight of Mr. Grayson's words, his eyes locked on the old man's face. Later that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mr. Grayson than anyone in the neighborhood realized. Why was he so closed off from everyone? And why did he seem so connected to Max? I decided to ask around, hoping someone might know more about him. But every conversation led to the same response: shrugs, guesses, and rumors about a past he refused to share. As the days passed, Max's bond with Mr. Grayson only deepened. I started noticing small changes in the man himself, a slight wave when I passed by, the faintest trace of a smile when he saw Max. It was as if my dog was unlocking a part of him that had been shut away for years. But what was behind that door, and why had it been locked for so long? Something told me the answers weren't going to be simple. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I noticed Max acting more restless than usual. He paced by the door, letting out small, anxious whines. Something was bothering him, but I couldn't figure out what. When I opened the back door, he darted straight for the fence, slipping through the familiar gap before I had a chance to call him back. This time, I didn't wait. I followed him immediately, my heart racing, unsure of what I was about to walk into. When I stepped into Mr. Grayson's backyard, I found him sitting on the ground, leaning against the base of a tree. He looked pale, almost fragile, and Max was right there by his side, nudging him gently with his nose. My chest tightened as I realized something was wrong. "Mr. Grayson?" I called out, my voice trembling. He didn't respond immediately, but when he finally looked up, his expression was a mix of vulnerability and exhaustion. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his voice was weak. "Just got a little dizzy. Your dog's a good one. Stayed right here." I crouched down beside him, unsure of what to do. "Are you sure you're okay? Maybe I should call someone." "No," he cut me off, though there was no anger in his tone, just a quiet determination. "I don't need anyone fussing over me." There was a long silence as Max sat close to him, his warm presence seeming to provide some kind of comfort. I noticed something clutched in Mr. Grayson's hand, a small weathered medal. It looked military, with faded engravings that hinted at years of history. He caught me looking at it and gave a bitter chuckle. "This," he said, holding it up for me to see, "is all I have left of him. My dog from the war, Rex, best partner I ever had. His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time, I saw the weight he'd been carrying all these years. Max let out a soft whine, resting his head on Mr. Grayson's knee, as if he understood every word. The connection between them suddenly made sense. But before I could ask more, Mr. Grayson's expression changed. His eyes shifted toward the house, and he said something that sent chills down my spine. "They're back. They're back," Mr. Grayson repeated, his voice low but laced with tension. I froze, glancing at Max, who had gone completely still, his ears alert. It felt like the world had suddenly shrunk to just the three of us, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. "Who's back?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Mr. Grayson didn't respond immediately. His hand tightened around the metal, his gaze fixed on a dark corner of his yard where the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. "I don't know," he finally said, his tone a mix of fear and frustration, "but I've been hearing them. At night. Rustling, whispers, movements too precise to be animals." He looked at me then, his eyes sharp and searching. "I thought I was imagining it, but your dog, he knows. He's been sensing them too." I wanted to dismiss it, chalk it up to an overactive imagination, or the isolation that had clearly taken its toll on Mr. Grayson, but Max's behavior made it impossible to ignore. He stood now, his body tense, staring into the same shadowed corner, a low growl rumbling in his throat. My pulse quickened. Max was never aggressive without reason. If he was reacting this way, something, or someone, was definitely there. "Stay here," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I grabbed the flashlight from my phone and aimed it toward the shadows, my heart pounding in my chest. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but overgrown bushes and the tall wooden fence at the edge of the property. I exhaled slowly, relief starting to settle, until I noticed it. The bushes weren't still. They were moving subtly, as if someone was crouched behind them, trying to stay hidden. My breath caught, and before I could call out, Max bolted forward, barking ferociously. I stumbled after him, my flashlight shaking as I tried to keep up. By the time I reached the bushes, Max had stopped, standing rigid, his teeth bared. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I pushed the bushes aside, half expecting to find an animal, or maybe nothing at all. But what I found made my blood run cold. Footprints, fresh, deep imprints in the damp earth, leading away from the fence and disappearing into the woods beyond. Someone had definitely been there. I turned back to Mr. Grayson, who was watching me intently, his face pale. "This isn't the first time," he said quietly. "A few weeks ago, I found the same thing, tracks, and the fence. It's been tampered with before, but I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks." "What do they want?" I asked, my voice shaky. Mr. Grayson's gaze shifted to Max, who was still growling softly at the woods. "I don't know," he said, "but whatever it is, it's not good." In that moment, the distant sound of a snapping branch echoed from the woods. We both turned toward the sound, the tension crackling like static in the air. Something was out there, and it wasn't done with us yet. The snapping branch sent a jolt through both of us. Max was already on high alert, his body tense and his growl deepening into a bark. Without thinking, I stepped in front of Mr. Grayson, holding my flashlight like it could somehow protect us. The woods loomed dark and menacing, and the air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. "Stay back," Mr. Grayson muttered, trying to pull himself to his feet. But he was shaky, and I could tell he wasn't at full strength. Max, however, was already moving, his nose to the ground as he followed the scent trail left by the footprints. "Max, no!" I called out, but he didn't stop. He disappeared into the trees, his barking growing fainter with each step. Panic surged through me. I couldn't let him face whatever was out there alone. "I'm going after him," I said firmly, glancing back at Mr. Grayson. His expression was a mix of worry and something else, guilt. He hesitated before finally nodding, handing me the medal he'd been clutching. "Take this," he said. "It's not much, but it brought me luck once. Maybe it'll do the same for you." I didn't have time to question the gesture. Clutching the medal, I plunged into the woods, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trees closed in around me, their branches clawing at my arms as I pushed forward. Max's barking grew louder, more frantic, until suddenly it stopped. "Max!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the stillness. No response. My chest tightened as I quickened my pace, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Then, up ahead, I saw him, standing perfectly still in a small clearing, his tail wagging cautiously. I slowed down, scanning the area. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then I noticed it. A small makeshift campsite. Blankets, cans of food, and a few scattered belongings lay abandoned, as if whoever had been there had left in a hurry. Among the items was a framed photo of a younger Mr. Grayson, standing proudly in uniform, with Rex by his side. Before I could process it, a voice spoke from the shadows. "He's been protecting something, or someone." I spun around, my flashlight landing on a figure stepping out from the trees. It wasn't just anyone. It was Mr. Grayson's son, the one the neighborhood assumed was long gone. His face was lined with regret, and his eyes held secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. And then it hit me. This wasn't about danger. It was about reconciliation. But why had he waited until now to return? I stared at the man in disbelief, my mind racing to piece everything together. Mr. Grayson's son? No one had seen or mentioned him in years. The neighborhood whispered that he'd cut ties with his father long ago, though no one knew why. And yet, here he was, standing before me in the middle of the woods, his face a strange mix of guilt and hope. "Max led me here," he said softly, breaking the silence. His gaze flicked to my dog, who was now sitting quietly at my feet. "He's a smart one, just like Rex." I felt a lump in my throat at the mention of Rex, Mr. Grayson's old war dog. "You've been out here," I said slowly. "But why?" "Why now?" He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I've been trying to come back for a while, but I didn't know how. After everything I said to my dad, I wasn't sure he'd even want to see me. I thought it'd be easier to watch from a distance. Until tonight." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. I could feel the pain behind them, the years of missed chances and unspoken apologies. "He's been waiting for you," I said, my voice softer now. "You're his son. That never stopped mattering to him." His eyes glistened, and for a moment he looked like a man carrying too many burdens. "And Rex?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "He never got over losing Rex, did he?" I shook my head. But Max. Max reminds him of Rex. He's been helping your dad heal, bit by bit." There was a long pause before he finally nodded. "Then maybe it's time I stop hiding," he said, his voice steadier now. Together, we walked back to the house, Max leading the way. When we stepped into the yard, Mr. Grayson was waiting on the bench, his hands clasped tightly. His face froze when he saw his son, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, his son stepped forward and held out the medal I had given him earlier. "I think this belongs to you, Dad," he said. Mr. Grayson took it, his hands trembling, and for the first time in years, I saw something break in his expression, years of pain giving way to relief. "Welcome home," he whispered. As I watched the two of them embrace, Max wagged his tail and let out a joyful bark, as if celebrating a reunion long overdue. And in that moment, I realized something simple but profound. Sometimes, the strongest bonds are the ones we think are broken, and it takes a little kindness and maybe a dog to bring them back together.